Hello, all. Just so you know, we are getting in contact with the last one of our panelists just to see if we can get her on. We will start in about 2 or 3 minutes. So if you're eating breakfast, if it's lunchtime where you are, hope you consume, hope you have water, hope you have caffeine if that's a thing that you need in the morning or afternoon. I hope you have good smells in your space, something good to touch, something good to be here. If you're doing dishes, thank you for doing dishes. You know, that's how I usually webinars, I sit and do the dishes when I watch my webinars. So it's my natural thing. I'm going to imagine everyone in the audience is doing dishes.
It is amazing how tasks can be so much easier when you're actually paying attention to a webinar or a podcast or something.
I've even every once in a while risked it with Zoom things where it could be that someone asks me to speak and I'm doing dishes in that moment. I've risked, you know, over the past 2 years, I've done some risky Zoom things.
That's pretty dangerous.
It never went badly for me, you know, knock on wood. Wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and get started. We are currently, Taryn, thank you so much, is here getting in contact with Grace, who is our other panelist. So it may be that one more person pops in soon, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Phil Weaver-Stace. I go with the pronouns he, him. And I am an instructor of interdisciplinary collaboration and critical response at ASU. But in this moment, the hat that I'm wearing is the project lead of a project called Religious Space, which is out of the Interplanetary initiative at Arizona State University. Just for a little context for our time together, I'm going to give a little overview of what will happen. I will introduce the panelists. And for about the next hour, we're all going to have a conversation. There is also a chance for you all through the time to submit questions. And at around the top of the hour, I will start looking at those questions and adding those questions into our conversation. And we'll all close about 90 minutes from now. I just wanted to mention the grief that I have been going through and a lot of folks have been going through with the amount of mass shootings that have been happening recently. It feels like they have become a part of the culture of our nation. And there are many connections that could be made between these events and the conversation that we're having today. But just for now, I wanted to mention it because it was what I was thinking about when I took a walk this morning. And I said, this is what I'm thinking about today. So that is something that I wanted to mention. I'm calling in from a place that is called Tempe, Arizona, and it is a place where at least 23 Native nations have inhabited for centuries, including the Acamel O'odham peoples and the Peeposh communities that have cared for this land before me, before any of my colleagues, before any of my neighbors existed, and especially existed here. And for my personal acknowledgement and connection to this, I was raised with the logic of the colonizer. I was raised with this understanding that has to do with exploitation, that has very specific images about what progress and what primitive looks like. And those images I was raised with, that was my education. And over time, I have been grateful for people who have helped me understand a little bit more and challenge some of that imagery. So that is there's a land acknowledgement and also a personal acknowledgement about what it means to come from an ancestry of colonization. Today, we are going to be talking about stories and the stars, which more or less is a way of saying, how do we think about space in a context of something that is around religion, spirituality, philosophy, emotion, mentality, culture, society. This project was born out of a call from the Interplanetary initiative towards access and equity and critical thought when we conceive of space futures from a practical and technological side. And also, I said, well, also from a cultural side, a social side, a religious side. And I'm really thrilled to bring these panelists together. And there may be one other person joining us, Grace Dillon, in time. We're working through some technological things. But I want to introduce the two folks that are here. The panelist today, Mary Jane Rubenstein, is a professor of religion and science and society at Wesleyan University. She is affiliated with Feminist Gender and Sexuality Studies program, and she is the author, most recently, of Astrotopia, the Dangerous Religion of the Corporate Space Race. So has a lot to do with our discussion today. And also Natchee Barnd, or Blue, as he is sometimes known to his friends, is a comparative and critical ethnic studies scholar interested in the intersections between ethnic studies, cultural geography, and Indigenous studies. And his research focuses on issues of race and space and Indigenous geographies, and also writes about pedagogy, cartography, contemporary media, college cultural centers, and popular culture. So welcome, you two. If/when Grace shows up, I will also introduce her. I want to give the floor to first Natchee and then MJ, just to talk a little bit about your work, some things that you have been thinking about recently, and coming into this conversation, sort of what's percolating for you. Oh, Grace just joined us. I'm going to pause. So you can think about that a little bit more. I'm going to welcome Grace. Grace, can you hear us? Grace is just joining. Grace, Grace, Grace. Hello. You are muted.
Has the been going already, or did I mess things up?
Your entrance.
Can you hear me now?
We can. Your entrance could not be timed better because I was literally getting to your introduction.
Oh.
So it's perfect. You could not have done it better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you, Grace. Then I'll throw it to Natchee and MJ, and we'll come back to you, Grace, just so you have a little bit of time. So Grace Dillon, who just joined us, is a professor in the Indigenous Nations Study Department in the School of Gender, Race, and Nations at Portland State University. And Grace is best known for coining the term Indigenous futurisms, which is a movement consisting of art, literature, film, a TV series, music, dance, digital immersions, graphic novels, all sorts of forms of media, which express an Indigenous perspective of the past, present, and future in stories that engage and overgo the categorizations of speculative fiction. And Grace also serves on the ethnic board for the International Space Station, which is very pertinent to our discussion today. So I'm going to hand it to Natchee, and then MJ, and then you, Grace. And the question is just, what have you been thinking about recently? And coming into this discussion, what rises to your mind? Natchee.
Wow, that's a dangerous question. What have I been thinking about recently? So many things. And I won't obviously go into all of them. And I want to also echo your earlier statement about just sort of where we are right now. And as someone who has also elementary school kids, right, just trying to process that right now and thinking about that, which I think is related in some ways that I think will unfold as we move along. but just trying to breathe and sort of be present, which I think is an ethic that generally is something that can be useful for this conversation and this topic. Sort of shifting gears, you were mentioning names. Well, actually, I recently been working, I've just finished a piece with a bunch of colleagues who are conservation scientists on place names. Really was about sort of thinking through the relationship, in this case around national parks and sort of settler, colonial, and racist place names, and sort of processing what does that actually look like quantitatively as well as qualitatively in terms of what that does and what it reflects in us. And again, I think these are things that these are trends or ideas that will keep coming through as we go further in this talk. So I was thinking a lot about those relationships between the world around us and how we name it and sort of connect to it or disconnect to it or from it. I'm also working with a couple of the, you mentioned the land acknowledgement, I should say, right? I'm in what is currently called Corvallis, which is within what is currently called Oregon, which is in what is currently called the United States, which is, the territories of the Ampinafu Band of the Kalapuya, who are now whose descendants are now in the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz. And I'm working I work specifically with both of those communities. And one of the projects I'm working on with Grand Ronde is around installation art, or in and around Portland and other places. And, this practice of place keeping, right, which is very different than place making. It's connected and it overlaps, but that idea of place keeping. And I'm thinking about, for us today even, what are those relationships between place making and place keeping, and what does that mean when we're thinking about Earth and beyond? So there's a lot on my mind. I have a lot more to say, but I think maybe I'll keep it brief and then pass it on to MJ, and then we'll come back around.
I'm grateful for that, and grateful for your perspective on land specifically. When we think about space and we think about the land of other planets and we think about our land here, there's a lot to say. MJ.
Hi, everybody. Good morning to you over out west, and good afternoon to you over out east. I'm MJ Rubenstein. I teach at Wesleyan University, which is just on a bend in the Connecticut River, halfway between New York and Boston. And it is traditionally the land of the Wangung people, and it is near, about 40 minutes away from near to land that is still held by the Mashantucket Pequot tribal nation. So this is where I am here. I tend to work these days in particular on places that religion shows up in the sciences without necessarily announcing itself. Places that it emerges and even shapes the sciences without necessarily telling us that that's what it's doing. So when it comes to this conversation at stake today, the question of space and stories and religion and space and things like that. The thing that I want to, usually in my field, we don't lead with our conclusions, we build our conclusions, but let me lead with my conclusion and say, what I want to state clearly, and you can disagree, but what I want to state clearly and offer is that when we talk about science, like space science and religion, it is not a question of bringing them into conversation or trying to reconcile them or saying like, oh gosh, space needs some ethics, let's talk about religion and see what it can bring to space. What I want to suggest is that the science of outer space, the politics of outer space, the economics of outer space are already informed by religious stories already that don't necessarily announce themselves. And a lot of these stories, these religious stories already informing the secular space sciences, economics, politics, are bad for us. They're bad for the earth. They're bad for humans. They're bad for the more than human world. They're bad for the cosmos that we're trying to claim. So again, the trick to this like space and religion conversation for me is not so much to bring them into conversation, but to show how religion is already operating. What am I talking about? Where is religion in the space industry? It's right where we can't see it. It is woven into the most basic assumptions that undergird exploration itself. And these assumptions include, first, the idea that land on Earth in space can be private property. That is not an objective truth. It is not a universal truth. It is the product of a story. Second, the idea that the animals and vegetables and minerals of this Earth and of other cosmic bodies are resources. So we can call them resources to be used for human benefit, not an objective truth. That is the product of a story. The idea that humans are the most important life forms on Earth, product of a story. The idea that humanity has the right to be immortal, if not individually, maybe collectively as a species. That is the product of a story. The idea that human well-being can be measured in economic profit, or the idea that time moves progressively in a line from some dark primitive past into some glorious technofab future. These are all stories, and then they present themselves as somehow universally true because they inform Western science, and Western science is the mode that it's sort of modus operandi undergirding space exploration, space politics, space economics. The list of these assumptions goes on. You can find your own, right? There are tons of them. But these ideas are the product of a specifically religious worldview. They're, in short, the product of the global victory of a particularly imperial form of Christianity over every other way of living. And when I talk about imperial Christianity, I do not mean your like social justice-y, earth-loving Pope Francis type Christians. I mean imperial Christianity, which took root in the 15th century in particular, and globalized itself, and is now trying to reach toward the stars, calling with Donald Trump, the heavens are manifest destiny. That kind of imperial Christianity that's often not even Christian, right? It was Christian imperialism that tried to uproot all forms of reverence for the earth itself, for earth creatures, insisting that the sacred, that God is outside the universe. Therefore, like nothing that you do inside the universe touches the sacred, and that God's favorite species is man, right? That humans are made in the image of God and that no other species is made in these are religious stories, again, that now seem to us sort of normal, scientifically proven facts. It was Christian imperialism that gave the so-called New World to Spain and France and England, justifying the conquest of these lands by assuring us that, by assuring Europeans that they were saving humanity. And it's the same Christian imperialism that lies hidden in the basic assumptions of our seemingly secular space program and our seemingly atheist space barons, our Musks and our Bezoses, seeking to conquer outer space for the alleged sake of all humanity, right? We see these ideological justifications doing the same kind of work that they have done for 500 years in the colonial project. So I'm happy to go on and on about this. But again, I just wanted to say that, you know, at least my work in this conversation, especially not belonging to an Indigenous nation and having Indigenous ties, is really to show where it is that religion is operating so that we can listen to other kinds of stories and maybe privileged stories and center stories that ask us not so much how we can get the universe to belong to us, but how we might belong to the universe instead, right? There are better stories to tell.
Really, really grateful for that, MJ. I had the feeling like, in a way, the image that came to mind as you were speaking was this idea of that the platform has been built upon which we do work. And you're saying, can we go underneath and look at every single beam and every single structure and every single nail and say, what is this built on? What is the thing that's built on? Really grateful for that. Grace, how are you? What have you been thinking about? What are you bringing?
Well, we're finishing up a collection of the Routledge Handbook of Co-Futurisms. And I have been very delighted to work with Isaiah Lavender III from the University of Georgia, an African-American scholar who has written many Afrofuturist books and books on race. Our second editor, Taryn Taylor, is Panamanian American. Her mother was Panamanian. So she works with our Latinx and Abayala literatures of South America and into Spain. And then Bodavista Chattopadhyay, who has worked with this center a lot as well, who is from India, but is currently a professor at the University of Oslo in Norway. He's handling our Gulf futurisms or Middle East futurisms, and many segmented aspects of Asian futurisms. And then we have woven throughout LGBTQAI to Spirit plus elements that appear, and also, and I put the parentheses around disabled because that can be questionable, but working with neurodiversity and abled diversity forms. All of those are going on in that. So it turned into quite a huge collection. And we're looking for it to come out this year.
That's really beautiful. And it makes me think particularly around, as you speak about all of the different futurisms, about how we imagine the future from all of these perspectives. Oftentimes, if we use this idea of futurism, we are settling into an assumption of what future we're talking about, of whose future, of who is all of these things. So I wanted to ask, grateful for all of you bringing what you're bringing. I'm curious about our relationship to land on Earth, and what is our history of relationship to land on Earth, and how does that relationship inform what we assume our relationship will be in space? What has that history been, and what are we bringing to that? Anyone who wants to jump in with a thought, happy to. Yeah, Natchee.
Well, yeah, I guess I'll just throw something out there. It doesn't need to be long here, and I think MJ was already kind of mapping this out. But the first question to that question is, that, who is the our, who is the we that we're referencing when we're talking about this notion of relationship to land? Obviously, there's quite a lot of answers to that question. I think if we settle down on the, and I use that term intentionally, on the sort of the dominant sort of narrative, the dominant sort of structure of power in terms of shaping those relationships, I would even then question the use of the term relationship in a way. I think it's used in maybe a too loose of a way. It is a relationship, but I think often about the pairing of relationships and responsibilities together. I think those are crucial connection points that I think get lost, and we instead, in the sort of the dominant frames, replace that with relationships and rights, right? The right to do X, the right to do Y, and that manifests in everything from the billionaire astronauts to to the everyday folks who want to enact violence because of the things that they don't have that control over. And I think thinking about those things together are going to be really important, this notion of relationships and responsibilities. And I think it also is, in terms of the beyond, outside of the planet, right, is how can it be anything other than what it is now, right? As I think Anais Nin, right, has famously quoted or said or written, right, we don't see the world as it is, we see it how we are, and we're going to see space how we are as well. And so that relationship is going to transfer over for all the beauty and all the sort of tragedy that we are. And this is where I feel like Indigenous stories have long reminded us of this, and why we need to have these sort of ceremonies to remind us of those relationships and responsibilities in ways that don't center us, but remind us that we are here and this is what we are. So I'll start with that and throw that out there, because I think MJ set that up really nicely, and I know Grace is going to run with this, and so I'll throw that out.
Yeah, I want to draw out this idea of responsibilities. How would you respond to what are our responsibilities, both to the land that we inhabit now as a peoples, and a land that we imagine inhabiting. Grace or MJ?
Okay. Well, first of all, to me, land, or aki is our word for land, um, is a living entity. Mitsu Kumikwa, or Mother Earth, is a big living entity, and it contains the vastness of spirit beings, spirit ancestors, um, all different kinds of forms, where even the taking care of land, or our gikandasalan, we call it, our so like our ways of knowledge about plants and herbs and sciences in connection with that, um, are informed by our ceremonies, our sweat lodges. For us, Indigenous sciences, as Gregor Kahete has pointed out, um, in his, and it's a beautiful title to suggest that kind of spirituality or spirit consciousness, from his Indigenous community, rekindling of the teachings of the seventh fire. And in chapter 5, he goes into numerous definitions of what Indigenous sciences really is. And it is always showing that it's a mutual responsibility, uh, a mutual reciprocity. And for us, that is uh, a connection between plant nations, animal nations, um, crawlers, and others that are not necessarily immediately lumped in with human nations, right? But as Lisa has talked about, she's from the Abenaki Nation, and she has a book called The Common Pot, and she explains the uh, concept, the Abenaki concept of the common pot, as kind of you're in this area, and within this area, um, everyone, uh, there's no hierarchical placement. There's no, because the Thunderbirds can fly higher, they do not have then, therefore, a superior quality to the mountain lynx serpent that we have, that fights. It's a water creature, where they have tremendous fights, and then that can create huge storms, and especially with our global weirding going on now, um, really frantic kind of battles going on in that way. And so I guess, having respect for Ake is also having a respect for the entire common pot. I mean, it's the air, it's the water, it's so much more that is integral to that land, and we honor that always then with a high context Indigenous science, which means that we don't just start with labs and then stop there with taxonomic surveys and reports that are published. Rather, we combine and fuse that kind of knowledge. We bring it into our knowledges because we're very adaptive and dynamic. And that's really, for a Anishinaabe person, that is the essence of tradition, is to be ever dynamic, ever changing, ever meeting the situation in a kind and generous way. And that generosity is to be extended to all nations, including the ones that I referenced, and even phenomenological persons, which would be like weather changes or the kind of weather fusions that we are experiencing right now with pyro tornadoes and things of that nature. And I was thinking that in Moonshot, the Indigenous Comics Collection, Volume 3, edited by Elizabeth LaPense and Michael Shayashi, we start our Indigenous science in a full context with singing, dancing, drumming, ceremony, ceremonial moments in our inipi, in our sweat lodge, and other practices of ceremony. And this shows up very much throughout a lot of the stories in this Indigenous Futurism special issue as a graphic novel. And I was just going to mention then that having that inipi, having the sweat lodge moment becomes very, very important. I'll just stop right there.
I'm grateful for that. I'm also so grateful, Grace, that you are so connected to naming that you said high context, and I'm always impressed and so grateful for how much you name where knowledge comes from, where all of this comes from. It's just really wonderful to experience. MJ, there was so much there. We've talked about responsibilities, the sense of equality. What's on your mind?
Thank you both. What's on my mind is that in order to encourage responsibility to land, in order to encourage responsibility to plant nations and animal nations and crawling nations, especially if we're again thinking about outer space and the major agents of space, of prospective space colonization and things like that. What's on my mind is working at clearing away, again, the bad relationships to land that this particular globalized order has produced, and the place they come from narratively, again, like the story, the bad story that produces. There are bad stories and bad rituals too, right? Not all rituals are good, not all ceremonies are good. If you think about ceremonially, Europe's conquest of the so-called New World depended on the obsessive ritual of sticking a tall vertical thing in the ground. And then also reading a text, and that text was usually a text about the God who had created all peoples, and who had created all peoples in such a way that everybody in this land now had to listen to Spain, right? So these are ritual recitations. So again, we need good ceremonies and good rituals, and we need to be able to call them out in order to, and from the the Spaniards landing on Hispaniola, what's now Hispaniola, to Apollo 11 installing that flag on the moon. It's the same gesture, right? Which indicates that we, as space aspirational technocrats, are still under this same relationship to land, which assumes land to be the opposite of what Natchee and Grace was just saying, right? It assumes land to be inanimate on the one hand and empty on the other hand. And this traces all the way, you can trace this all the way back, from Armstrong's and Aldrin's sticking that flag in the moon, back to Manifest Destiny, which claimed God's endorsement of the white takeover of the whole Western terrain and expanse of the US, back to the doctrine of discovery that insisted that there was nothing in the so-called New World, and since there was nothing there, terra nullius, no one's land, it was Europe's to take. This is always a fallacy, and we can take it all the way back to the myth of Canaan in the Hebrew Bible, where God tells God's chosen people, I'm going to take you to a land flowing with milk and honey. It's just for you. It's yours. Incidentally, it also happens to belong to, at the moment, the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Jebusites and once you get in there, you're going to clear them all out. because they can't exist alongside you, because if they exist alongside you, they will lead you into idolatry. So the relationship to the land is, again, possession. This is yours. Property, this is yours and nobody else's, and a kind of violent background. It's that the land is just an inanimate, inert background to the drama of some humans taking over other humans. This carries all the way through the earthly fantasy and the earthly colonization. And what troubles me is that now, when you ask somebody like Bob Zubrin, who's president of the Mars Society, who wants to imagine human colonies on Mars, who wants to get us to human colonies on Mars, when you say, hey, Bob, aren't you just replaying this old fantasy of, empty terrain and infinite frontier that has been carrying us through from this Canaan myth he says, no, it's different this time. Now we actually have empty land because there's nobody on Mars, because Mars is empty and the moon is empty, and we can do whatever the hell we want to it because those things are empty. There are no indigenous people there. And what I want to ask is, have you asked indigenous people whether there are indigenous people there, right? Like, have you listened to indigenous people to ask whether it's okay this time? So it's the same, again, it's that same story of this promise of empty land. And even the folks who are, the most gung-ho space colonizers will say like, yeah, oops, sorry, First Nations, Europe made a mistake there, but like now we can finally do whatever we want because we finally have empty land. So it's precisely getting right about what land is, and that I think is important here.
Can I add on to that? Just
please.
I think the other element is that, let's imagine there is nobody there, quote unquote. It's not about whether there's someone there. It's about who you become through that process. Who are you creating in yourself, right? Your story reminds me, for folks who maybe want a really easy, nice way to sort of think about this comparison. I know Thomas King has a piece in his Truth About Stories book. You'll never believe is a great way to start You'll never believe what happened is a great way to start a story. And he maps out these two different kind of creation narratives and how it shapes not just your belief in some spiritual realities, but the actual fundamental way in which you engage with the world and create yourself, right? So whether it's human-centric or not, whether it's a cooperative model or a competitive model, right? And we see that even when we scientifically look and try to understand how non-human animals engage with each other. There are stories of cooperation, and we're only now starting to see those come through scientifically, where it was always this very Darwinian and competitive model. Whether or not the place to be is here or somewhere else, whether it's spatial or temporal, right? Is it of this earth, or is it some other earthly or non-earthly space that you're aiming at? How you politically organize yourself, all those are implicated in those stories that MJ kind of says are the foundation, which then shape everything after. And then, so that's partly why I was suggesting that you're going to bring it there, wherever there is, and you're going to recreate yourself, whether or not there's an actual parallel of colonization and genocide or not, that at least one side of that equation isn't going to be shifted unless it's actively shifted, which I think was the charge. You have to decide, this is a story. Is this really the right story?
Yeah, Grace.
Yes, I mean, I'm exploding with thoughts with what MJ and Natchee are bringing up, and I'm very excited about it. And let me see if I can just give a few Indigenous futurist examples of what was discussed just now. So for MJ, I'm so grateful that you brought up the terra nullius concept. And Claire G. Coleman, who's Australian First Nation, has written actually a science fiction and Indigenous futurism's novel called Terra Nullius specifically. And within that story, it is set in such a way that aliens, at first you're just reading it as a stolen generation, residential, Catholicism, all of the kind of wording and the containment and curbing of First Nations thinking and ways of recognizing spirit beings and spirit moments. And then so in that case with Terra Nullius, it's the aliens that visit Earth. And it's an Earth that has been, it's where we're headed, you know, and she wrote it by traveling all around Australia and went all to the sacred spots with her partner, her female partner at the time. And they took a look at that, and then what she did is she created these aliens, we find out, that are like big toads. They have the reactions and need for water, and so they end up in this very desert, hot, continent of Australia. And so they're trying to take over, and they view it as terra nullius, as the very title of the book is called. But as you go along, there's Johnny Proudstar, who is one of the giant alien toads, who gets together with outlaws who are First Nations, and they actually start creating forms of resistance to what has been going on. And they recognize it as a colonization with limited knowledge, that idea of viewing the land as empty. And I can't help but think we can't view any Ake as empty. And that is brought up in her second book. It's not a sequel, it's called The Old Lie. And in that case, that is spaceships, and that is us as human beings going off into other worlds and then getting into a kind of forever war in many ways. And so that in a lot of the Indigenous futurisms novels, they play around with both the problematic aspects of colonization and bring in the contrasts with Indigenous communities and their movement towards it. And I just wanted to mention one other one, which is Jerry Williams' The Black Ship. And to also really promote the native operated presses, these two exist in Canada, but they're completely operated by First Nations people. And the first one is the Thetis Press, THEYTUS Press. And so Jerry William was actually one of the editors and very involved in this particular press, and then put through his own the Black Ship series that he was working on. And he was very interested in bringing in the histories of the different forms of colonization, and again, stealing their children, and the kind of trauma that is being passed down intergenerationally at this point. And speaking of Ake or land, there's this really interesting moment where he has Enid Starbreaker is the main character, but she has been gathered up as a child by what is the Repletion Empire. You know, and you can think of it in a Star Wars sense, or you can think of it in a Dune sense. You know, all of those kind of fit, and he had that in mind. And it can even involve those that are native, but have kind of lost their way and lost their forms of knowledge. And so you have one man who is her uncle, and so he's with the what are really native and indigenous peoples that are being colonized by the Repletion Empire in a very genocidal kind of way. There are many genocidal attempts. But Leon ends up on this very mysterious world called the Corral World. He flies his ship to that. And most people that have gone to that world find it very eerie, very scary, and they soon leave very, very quickly. And he decides to stay. And in the process, and so there's this moment where you think, oh, Leon, he's okay, he's going to be safe because he's native, but no, what he does is he, in experimentation with this planet of a whistling wind, whistling grass, and trees, he sets up bombs all over and so that the trees are exploded. But the life and the Ake of that land is not gone. The fires that he creates through those bombs and everything else simply disappear, and there's no vestige of it left. So it actually takes on, it's a thinking conscious entity like Solaris, right? As a planet, as a famous science fiction novel where you have a planet that is so sentient and so able to think that they can even fool sometimes the human persons that are approaching them and recognizing that they are alive, but not to the degree that they are. And what's important about Leon is that elders, because of what he has done, go to the Krell world. And that's that sense of mutual responsibility or reciprocity, that if one of your people has done damage to another planet or another land or Aki, that it is your responsibility to observe it, witness it, check it out, and make sure that that has not been contaminated forever. And I'll just stop there.
Yeah, I'm grateful for all of these. And just to mention, I mentioned it in the chat, afterwards, I'm going to ask all three of you to create a list of stories that you want to share, and we'll send out an email with all of these things, because there's such a rich, you're drawing on such a rich history. And I wanted to draw out this idea of stories. And you've all talked about this. MJ, you talked about these stories of what it means to happen to plant a flag. And it is challenging, because the first time I imagined the American flag on the moon, it is presented as a triumphant story of human progress. And it is challenging to flip that entirely on its head and say, what the hell is a nation doing here? Why is it a symbol of a nation and ownership? Which is a really challenging image, as we're raised in this idea of future. But this idea of stories and what it means to carry bad stories and good stories, and Grace in all your Indigenous futurism work is around creating new stories, creating new relationships to all these things. And I want to tie together this idea of what is the manner in which we may change some of these stories. So we've talked a lot about history and what the history of this is. How do we, as peoples, change the story about how we understand land? Are there particular, what is this, to use a very odd word, strategy for changing the story of how we understand our relationship to land, how we understand our relationship, responsibility, and rights to land, relationship, responsibility, and right to planets, to outer space, to all of these things? How do you change a story?
Well, you change a story with another story. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, right? It's you have to replace it with something. We are, right, and a lot of writers have talked about this. I mean, we are stories. That's all we are, is stories. I mean, any of us can think individually about who we are. We are stories. We're our own stories. We're the family stories that we have of us. We have other people's stories of us, so that they're not all under our control. but they do shape and morph us, and they create us. You know, whether we think we can try to be somehow independent individuals existing outside of that or not, the reality is you cannot. So the task is really to think about, well, what are the stories that replace this? And this is why I was suggesting that reading around having this comparative where you can kind of see the implications of these stories as they sort of play out. I'm thinking also about W. Du Bois right now, because he was talking about the story of whiteness and what whiteness is. And we could probably, you know, multiply that and think about it just in terms of dynamics of power, but for the purposes of history and the way it's played out, at least up until fairly recently, right? And he's talking about, he has this quote, right? Whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever, amen, right? Which is a really powerful way of framing it. The way that sense of title to the universe, and he uses that phrase, right? This notion of who has title to the universe is embedded in what that means. And it's racialized, it's also gendered, it's, you know, it's also, you know, manifested in all these different ways in which we identify ourselves, and they're all rooted in those stories. So having to actually recognize that they're stories, then to step back and say, are these the stories that we want? And we see these battles constantly. Like when I mentioned the place name work I'm doing, you can talk about the Confederate statue work. Right? These are all battles over stories, right? And they're not easy. I will, you know, we want to say that right from the front, because it's not as easy as just, okay, we're going to swap this from that, right? There's consequences to who we are if we change our story. And we have to sort of confront that. And I think that's a really difficult thing for us to do. This is where ceremony comes in, right? Is sort of having to sit with yourself in a way that's really reflective and not so egotistical and self-centered and harmful. As Grace mentioned, it's thinking about what is your role, what is your need to do for those who are part of your, you know, your people, whatever that might, however you might define that, and what are your responsibilities to that. And the stories are the ones that tell us that, you know, who are we responsible for? Who can we dismiss? And how often do we dismiss that? And we say, oh, that's not us. You know, something really terrible happens and that's not really us. This isn't us. We just announce that. It is us. And how do you pull that into yourself and shift the story? So that would be my like initial response to that.
Yeah. Other thoughts, Grace or MJ? Yeah, MJ.
Yeah, I've got two thoughts that I fear I can't quite get together. But one is, I think it's important to give up on the hope of a single story that's going to unite the whole world. Again, that's the colonial fantasy that wants to draw the entire universe into the same story in order to organize people hierarchically and to say these people are in charge of these people, right? If you can't have qualitative difference, people living under genuinely different stories, then you have to have quantitative difference. It's one story for everybody, but there are people who are in charge of everybody else, right? So again, it seems like it's such a great gesture when the Spaniards land on the shores of Hispaniola and say, like, the same God created us all. Oh, how beautiful! And the same God told us this is our land. So fuck off, right? Like this is not. So that gesture is a bad gesture, and I think it's important to be able to listen to the stories of other people without claiming them and without determining that, without saying, therefore, they have to be your story, right? So when those of us who are not Kanaka listen to the stories of the defenders of Mauna Kea, right, where they're trying to build a 13th telescope, bigger, better, more phallic telescope on top of the sacred Mauna, it does not require like white folks like me to be like, Mauna Kea is my ancestor too. You don't have to take on that story as your own and make it yours in order to have respect for the people for whom that story is operational. So there has to be some relationship to stories that allows for a proliferation of and a respect for stories without an adoption of those stories, right? We don't have to find the one that, because the one that's going to hold for us all is always going to be on the colonizer's terms, right? It's always going to be like the story of evolution. We can finally get on board with that, right? Can't we just all get on that? That's one thing. The other thing is that I think it's important to distinguish between individuals and institutions from time to time. Institutions form individuals, I know, right? They give us what's possible, fine. But I wrote this book a while ago on pantheism, the idea that the universe and like the many agents of the universe are what we mean when we say the word God, right? And like academics got annoyed, but like everyday people, including like retired white folks in library reading groups and like retired church ladies and things like that, we're all like, yeah, I think I'm a pantheist, right? Just people who were raised Jewish, raised Christian, raised whatever, raised like ex-Quaker, they're like, yeah, that sounds about right to me. And when I tell like ordinary white folks, hey, did you know that the US and corporate interests want to frack the moon? Like, they're like, that doesn't sound right to me. You don't have to have a great metaphysic subtending your upbringing in order to say like, I don't know, man, I don't think it's a great idea to frack the moon. Like there are all sorts of people who are ready to like, who don't have the privilege of being First Nation, who don't have right, but who are ready to hear these stories and who are ready to live into them. It's just that our institutions, for example, NASA, will not admit the possibility that Mars might not want to be mined, that the moon might not want to be mined. So I think that there's a real anyway, I have a lot of faith in the possibility of small communities, of individual humans, even white folks. But we need to figure out how to speak back to our institutions, right? We need to figure out how not just to let NASA make a graphic that's like, oh, look at this woman of color walking on the moon. Won't that be fantastic? But have NASA actually say, okay, just so you know, this is what the Moon to Mars plan means. We are going to take all the water we possibly can from the moon. We are going to harness every asteroid we possibly can, blast the shit out of it, and then figure out how to get to Mars, terraform it, maybe nuke it a la Elon. Like, tell us what you're up to actually, and then let people actually respond, right? And because again, my church lady people are like, I don't think that's a good idea. That doesn't sound right to me. Yeah.
I'm grateful for this. And this idea that, as you say, it doesn't take some deep understanding for us to intuitively have some relationship with some of this. Yeah, Grace.
Oh boy, it's so funny. You guys are just sparking me all over the place that I have to watch out for it. But first of all, I wanted to bring up that, when I grew up in my community, we actually read many books, including many Western books, English translated. And I grew up with various languages, Anishinaabe, my own language, English, of course, but we also had Finnish, we had Russian, Norwegian. We had a number of things going on. And for us, we always keyed in on the scientific biologist Peter Kropotkin rather than Charles Darwin, because Peter Kropotkin is always known as this pacifist anarchist, and his book of mutual aid in 1901, 1902, was quite a while ago. He was actually expelled from Russia for his radical ideas at the time, which is that actually in his observances in Siberia, he was seeing how communities of animal nations, plant nations, human, and so on, were actually creating alliances, and through those mutual alliances, that's how they were able to survive. So rather than the social Darwinian, rise to the top hierarchically and kill off those around you, and then you were superior somehow, and your mutant change has become the one that is the best change. We really aligned our Anishinaabe thinkings with Peter Kropotkin, and I've heard that a lot from different Indigenous nations when I speak with them. In terms of stories, Indigenous futurism itself, it will be discovered, is a combination of mind, body, spirit, just inherently and intrinsically within it. And I'm basing that on and gladly borrowing from Sammy Shulk, who talks about body mind in term as an African American woman who experiences disabilities herself and wrote about that for Black female speculative authors, and it's just a very beautiful book. And when I think of the patterns that take place, often the patterns that can take place in reading these stories, especially I would say the YA novel, YA adult novels, are very much this way. And that is that you go through this process of awakening as you're reading through things from this Indigenous standpoint, right? Specifically. And you have this awakening that can be filled with horror and trauma simultaneously as you're discovering it. I'll give an example here in just a second. But that going through that process and then going to the transformational forms of justice, whether it's climate justice, environmental justice, racial justice, and so on, it becomes the story itself, the novel, the graphic novel, the film, whatever it is. If you go through that kind of awakening and embrace that horror to a certain degree, then it becomes mashkiki. It becomes medicine and true medicine because you've gone through the process. So I'm just going to really quickly reference a book. Well, it's a tribe series by Ambeline Kwaimulina, who is also Australian First Nations. And there's a moment where there's a young girl's appearance in a forest, and this is 300 years later after our time. Our time is called the Reckoning, and with all the climate changes and global weirding, we basically just destroy the earth, right? And so she's going through. I'm going to cut out some of this, but she is with the reckoning, the time of great chaos of global weirding, climate change, and the continuous imbalances of systems 300 years ago. And so they're speaking of our time currently, 300 years ago. In this world of balance and the greater balance, the first wood, and it's trees that are first wood because they've grown up for 300 years. From the seeds of old trees. So they're old growth, considered old growth in this time. Felt immediately brighter than it should be. Quote, the colors so vivid it almost hurt to look at them. Plus, I was glowing with a faint blue light, unquote. So you're suddenly entering into this, mysterious blue light coming around you in really, really vivid colors. When citizens died, their spirits were supposed to go to the greater balance, the world soul. Ashala thinks that the illegals, including her, quote, did too, even though the government said our fate was uncertain, being as we were outside the natural order. And that was what has been done to so many indigenous peoples, right? We are either made the fauna and the flora in a plant sense or sometimes an animal sense, or we have this that we're somehow outside of the natural order of the hierarchical chain that's been created, right? Her dreaming feeling like being in a reflected and mirrored world that leads her to a deep, deep lake, one she recognizes as her lake, as a massive snake, pale blue scales shimmering with rainbows in the light, and grandfather serpent. And he says, I am your many times grandfather, one of the creators of your people. He becomes her mishkiki, her medicine of healing, as he brings up and voices out loud her pain that she doesn't even realize that she carries. She's just terms herself as an illegal, views herself as one, is worried and cautious about her powers. And it is this spending of time with Grandfather Serpent that shifts her around. The conversation between them decolonizes, cleanses, and heals her mind. It also gives her hope of endurance and persistence, in spite of being hunted for and incarcerated as a dangerous illegal surrounded by enforcers. Grandfather Spirit assures her that his kind have taken many forms and continues to do so. Quote, when the great chaos began, I was sleeping down in underground water. My resting place broke apart, and I was cast out into the end of everything, unquote. But notably, the end of everything serves as a catalyst for Grandfather. I journeyed for a long time, gathering all the scraps of life that I could find. I brought them here. Then I sang, reminding life of its shapes, strength, and its many transformations, until life remembered its nature and grew, unquote. As one of the old spirits of earth, he offers her aid anytime she may need it. Quote, you might be the last to carry the bloodline of those I created in the world that was, unquote. And so that's just a quick example. And then I was thinking in terms of working through, since you mentioned fracking on the moon, I immediately thought of the graphic novel story in Moonshot, They Come for Water. And it's filled with dystopic imagery. It hits one as no new technology in this future has innovatively provided for the challenge of healing our own waters globally. While Aki, the Earth, disintegrates, a space race to rush towards extraction of water from Mars speeds on in the story. So, water and fracking on the moon. As the imagery of the process of extraction becomes clearer, this sequence also reminds us of the tar sands, Standing Rock, and so many other moments of destroying Aki and bodies of water. In that sense, it is a native apocalypse with the notion that we are already experiencing this today, presently, not just in an imagined future. Here, that is furthered when all Native communities are banned from access to the extracted water from Mars. And you can see this happening too, right? Where there will be different communities, different groups of people with our billionaire made, new ones made every day or so. Recently, there was a survey talking about that during the COVID years, that we've just had heaps of billionaires being created. Well, they are not going to be offering opportunities to everyone, right? And so in this case, it's the Native communities that are banned from access to this extracted water. But it becomes an unexpected blessing for those Native communities, because the brown contaminated water that fills glasses are a haunting echo of the photos from the still ongoing Flint water crisis and water crises elsewhere. Inflection activates with insatiable greed, and the ones who eat the eaters fulfill this eco horror. In the meantime, and so this is the other side, the positive and healing side. So that's the awakening side, right? The positive and healing side is that Native female water walkers with families safely tucked away in the mountains become Ogichida'a, or warriors who work hard for balance and peace, because that's actually what our meaning of warrior is. It's not fiercely battling and taking over and conquest. To be a genuine warrior is to strive and always progress towards peace and balance. And okay, I'll stop there.
I'm grateful for this, Grace. And it's beautiful for you. I mean, it's it's interesting to think about this idea that you talk about of stories being medicine and what it means to be medicine and the medicine that we need. And I remember I was working on a project a long time ago about bringing stories of Indigenous peoples to Mennonites, which is my heritage, and helping Mennonites understand their own relationship to being colonizers, because Mennonites see themselves as people who were oppressed. And then you then teach people, okay, you also participated in this other thing. And we thought about this in terms of this, like, what does it mean to have this story of what is, how can new stories be medicine? And how can they be healing for people? We only have about 15 more minutes together. This time I could sit and talk all day. And so I guess the last sort of thing that I am curious to ask all of you is, if we imagine that we come from this really negative, destructive history of these stories, of what it means for us to relate to land, relate to each other, create hierarchy, create colony, this idea of colonizers, what is the medicine? What does the medicine look like? And how do we grow this medicine, an understanding of this healing, an understanding of a better future or better conversations, both here with ourselves and also for institutions like NASA, like Arizona State University, like the universities that we are in, like the private companies that are doing this stuff. What does the medicine look like?
Well, I'll just follow the pattern here,
Sure.
since I usually jump in here. I mean, I should preface it by saying, right, the alternative is, right, not viable. So we have to kind of look forward in these ways, right? The alternative is to accept what is and what will always be, and I think a lot of people accept that and they go with that, and I think that feeds in. The first thought that came to my mind was just the word kinship, right? Sort of thinking through models of kinship that we don't know how to manifest very well. And I say we in the sense of like on the larger scale and globally, and sort of, we can, but I think at anywhere, at any time, we can find the ways in which those models of kinship are broken. And this would be a radical sense of like a broad model of kinship that extends beyond those who look like us in all the ways, everything from how many legs we have to what kinds of skin we have to everything else in between, and all the other beings that exist with us. So I feel like kinship is it's an interesting term, and it can lose its power, but right now it feels like it has a power that is needed because we're in such a place of antagonism. I think kinship is a place where you can sort of find that model for not 100% agreement. I agree with MJ. We're never going to be the same people in the same model in the same way, but like any of our families, right? We have people that we don't even really like that much, but they are our kin, and we find a way to be in relation with them, and we want the best for them. And I think expanding that notion of kinship is really important, and not in the way that also was brought up in the kind of the Christianize the world kind of way, like we're all the same under God, but just that notion of thinking through what a different form of kinship would look like. And I think, and as I said in the beginning, because the alternative is nothing, it's not viable, it's not tenable, we know that, so it has to go that way, and you have to aim it, whether we achieve it, right? It's never about whether you can achieve it, it's about whether you're moving in that direction and it's the right thing to do. It doesn't matter if you're ever going to achieve it. I'm not going to save the rainforest one day and erase racism the next day and figure out gender inequality the next day, right? It doesn't work like that. It's not a sort of end game in that way. It's a process. It's a relational reality that we have to sort of reframe.
Yeah. Grace or MJ, decide what is the medicine that we need? How are you thinking about it? Yeah, Grace.
Or maybe we should let MJ go first, so that you go first, because I might chat too much. I'm worried about that. So go for it.
I think I'd like to offer the image of an emetic as a medicine, an emetic, which is to say something that makes you throw up. And there's got to be a way of administering some sort of substance to the masters of the universe to allow them to see, to bring up their own, like, what's in there, to be able to see what's in there, right? Rather than just, because again, I get worried about these projects. Like there's a project, NASA and the Navajo Nation, which does a lot of really beautiful work, but when it advertises itself to other people, it's like, look, see, the Navajo know so much about the stars, therefore they're our partners in doing what we were going to do already. If the colonizers don't first get a sense of what their own stories are, and we persist in this idea that somehow science and politics don't have stories, that they're just themselves, they're just neutral, and that you can like put this lovely, say, Navajo First Nation, whatever, any kind of patina on top of it to make it look palpable. There needs to be some kind of reckoning with the. I have this image of I have this fantasy of, there's a paper, I don't know if you know it, I'm happy to put this in our collective archive. There's a paper by a co-authored paper by the Bawaka country of the Northern Territory of Australia. And they're saying, look, we're becoming increasingly aware of what you're up to in the skies. In particular, Elon Musk, for example, launches 60 satellites every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks, 60 of them, like a little string of pearls, and then they're forever in low Earth orbit, forever. They don't go anywhere. They might collide with something and create more crap, but their space garbage just amplifies itself, right? So every 2 weeks we get 60 more satellites just from Elon Musk. Until 1957, there was only one satellite. It was the moon. Now there are just hundreds of thousands of pieces of rubbish up there. And Bawaka country is saying, we would like to let you know that our ancestors, when our communities, when members of our communities die, they process along the River of Stars, the Milky Way, and become ancestors, and that's where they live. And we are concerned that if you pollute the spaceways the way that you are doing, you're going to impede the progress of those souls. What I want to hear is somebody at NASA sitting down, actually listening to that story and responding. I want to hear, or Elon Musk, actually listening to that story and responding. And again, not trying to put some sort of indigenous patina on the thing that they were already trying to do, but to be faced with the prospect that there might actually be ancestors in the stars, and to say, which is what they'd have to say, no, there aren't, you're wrong. Right? So we could actually see the conflict. And then I think from there, so the medicine has to be the King's sort of creative disturbance, like bring the tensions to the surface. You like make Elon Musk say, no, your ancestors aren't in the stars, and then go from there, right? Rather than some like pretend that we can keep doing what we're doing, but make it look rosy by talking about what is NASA doing when it names the mission to frack the moon and destroy when it names it Artemis. That's a goddess. That is a goddess. The folks who worship Artemis these days don't want you to do that to the moon. But you can't have it both ways. You can't put this like beautiful religious spiritual thing on top of a mission to destroy something, right? So I want whatever that medicine is, that the medicine that makes things icky so that you can see it, right? And somebody has to offend somebody else, and then you can figure out what side you're on. That's the kind of medicine that I want.
That's good. And then that medicine also has to come with like some sort of doula or some person who holds that space and says, great, there's a whole bunch of conflict and tension. What is the doula? Where is the holder of that space to say, great, let's all hold this together. As Natchee was saying, the kinship. What is the kinship that holds us together when we're all vomiting up the conflicts that we have with each other? Grace, we have about 5 minutes and then we'll close.
Okay, so healing is bringing in stories that become practical everyday solutions. Wabashog rice and Moon on the Crusted Snow, even though that is not set in space, it could be easily translated into a space moment. It's a native community that suddenly finds itself without electricity, power, any kind of access to communication elsewhere. And then they have to get through that. And what the way they do it, their mashkiki, their medicine, is to go back to the ways of ceremonial thinking, providing a sema, we call it, or tobacco, as thanks to an animal brother or sister that has offered themselves to us, and we use every single portion of it so that there's no garbage, there's no waste of any kind. At the same time, simultaneously, they instill smudging ceremonies, and along with that, the protocols of, and I think this is very important, that when you acquire whatever you have, whatever food it is, or wood for fire, or whatever it is, that you first share it not only to the elders and to others in the community, but also to your perceived enemies. It's very important to be gifting them before you take your portions. And I think that that kind of protocol, which is also a spiritual value, becomes very important. The other thing I would say is just the really fun experimentational things that have taken place in reaction to certain forms of monocropping, along with genetic bioengineering, right, that Monsanto does or other places. And in reaction to that, there's things like Nananba Becker-She's Dene Navajo Nation, her film The Sixth World, where they are going to Mars. They are traveling in a spaceship to Mars. And she's gifted, quietly gifted, before she leaves. And not much is really emphasized with that, but they are the ancient seeds from her Dene nation. And she is a Dene astronaut going to Mars. And in the process, they're trying to simply grow corn. And this is before The Martian, where he's trying to grow potatoes. So they're trying to grow corn and have set this up in order to do so. But on the voyage over, all of the genetically bioengineered corn becomes rotted away, acquires all kinds of diseases, and ends up rotting away and dying. And so what she does is she quietly brings out her own seeds that had been gifted to her by her nation. And she also does ceremony, singing, dancing, as she is planting and then caring for and nurturing those. And then you see this image of Mars the land looking like the Navajo or Dene land as they are growing corn. And it's just a really, really beautiful kind of moment. And that provides a kind of mishkiki, I think. And then there's just all kinds of fun things. Like a lot of times when I was looking for space travel, we don't just do space travel, we do space-time travel, so that we have ways of traveling forward in space, but then also traveling back in time, so that sometimes what are even viewed as spirit ancestors giving advice are actually space-time travelers from the future. And they use very organic means. Like in one section, you get to see actual pecan. It's grown as a pecan tree for the form of a spaceship. And you can see through the graphical images and the different angles that's provided that it is a very smooth way to fly. And yet is highly organic in nature. So
Yeah.
that's that, instead of separating from nature, you're working within. In our language, we have no actual word for nature, but we do have words like anini, just being outside, or animi, everywhere. That's as close as we get to our concept of nature. But I wanted to end, I think, with Helen Heg Brown's Chakotay uh, film, The Cave, because that deals very much with spirit matters, so much that when he goes off on a trip and goes through tunnels and passages and it gets into this alien world, it is even in the credits called Spirit World and Spirit Woman #1, Spirit Woman #2, you know. And there's this beautiful moment where he, goes down and through and then out and up, because we have that in a lot of our sacred stories. You go up to go down and vice versa. And in that moment, when he first sees them in the spirit world after he crawls out of the hole, he is shocked and embarrassed and shows a very colonized sense of shame of seeing what he perceives as women's bodies in the nude, right? And they're of all different shapes, because Helen Hig Brown is a feminist. And by the way, these were actual tribal members doing it. And we were there with them, and, are not part of the film because we're Anishinaabe. It was just the Chakotay members. But we all took that moment to smudge ceremonially, be together, be disrobed in the sense that was very meaningful. And the response in the spirit world is to tell him, you need to go back where you came from, because you are not ready for us yet. And sometimes that's the sense that I have of us for truly doing spacefarer in a way that is not colonizing. Perhaps we are not quite ready yet, until we really do. MJ, like you say, I'm actually suddenly now on a, it's called Project Northern Star, and it is for NASA to suggest strategies and to do it from many, many, many different perspectives. And so I'll be, bringing in Indigenous futurism perspectives to that. So the very thing, MJ, that you were calling for, I think that, there are some efforts now, right? We have many, many steps to go, but there are efforts to bring in voices worldwide.
I'm really, really grateful for that, Grace. And we have just 1 minute left before we'll be ending our time together. Just wanted to send an immense amount of gratitude to our panelists, MJ, Natchee, and Grace, for this thoughts and all of your wisdom and all of your stories. We are going to be sending out, for those of you attending, we're going to be sending out an email with a recording of this that you all can have. And I'd also love to ask each of the panelists, you mentioned so many stories and so many things. There's a rich history. If you would send those to me, then we can put them together in the email when we send out everyone who registered, so that they can get those stories and see the names and images and who, so that they can go and look and continue this work. So thank you for those immense amounts of healing, what it means to create kinship, what it means to vomit up conflict and hold conflict, and what it means to do ceremony together and ask ourselves if we're truly ready for what's about to happen. So much gratitude. Thank you so much. Thank you for the Interplanetary Initiative, for all of this, for their support, and have blessings on the rest of your day. See you, everyone.
Thank you all, everyone.